Well, I think that obviously it will depend a lot on the context and the nature of the policy. In the time that when I was in government, when the government was thinking a lot about how to change how policy got delivered, a lot of the focus was on turning around institutions that were perceived to be either failing or performing quite poorly. So, for example, in the education system, the relatively small number of schools that were judged to be either failing or not producing the results that they should have done. In the National Health Service, obviously, there were concerns about the performance of some hospitals. And I think where the centralised delivery approaches seem to have made the most impact is in turning round organisations that seem to have been experiencing systemic issues around their performance and the quality of service, and turning them into relatively highly performing organisations. I think where the limitations of that approach are clearly that while they're good at turning organisations from being failing organisations into good organisations, they're not necessarily very good at turning them into excellent or great institutions. So the idea of the management theorists about this notion of going from good to great is, I think, a very difficult thing to achieve within centralised approaches to delivery and implementation. So I'm not, as it were, I think it's oversimplified to say top-down centralised delivery doesn't work. I think it works for doing some things in some contexts and not others. In terms of examples of implementation that have worked, I would also say that the Sure Start programme that I was involved in to some extent in my time in government, as well as the delivery of an expanded childcare system, was an example of a policy that got right the balance between central prescription and local autonomy. So rather than trying to go for this very centralised delivery approach, it did give more power to local Sure Start centres to shape provision according to the needs of a particular local area or a community, or even a group of particular families within that community. And I think that was quite effective at making sure that services really reflected the needs of a local area. But at the same time, the policy programme was prescriptive enough that you knew that programmes would be going on in every Sure Start centre that, according to the evidence, were most likely to be effective. So, for example, there was an element of educational provision, which was about getting kids ready for school. There was an element of dietary and nutritional intervention in terms of giving kids high quality food when they were in these centres. And there are many more examples. So I think it was a policy that worked well from an implementation perspective because it did strike the right balance between central prescription and local freedom. And I think very often in implementation, we're trying to always find the right balance between those two things. I'll just add to that very quickly that I think one of the problems from the perspective of British government is that we've tended to go through cycles where in some eras it's very fashionable to go for a highly top-down centralised approach, and then very quickly a government changes and you go in completely the opposite direction, and it's no longer about centralisation or about top-down, but it's all about give power back to local areas, don't set targets, don't set prescriptive management frameworks, don't hold professionals to account. I think that is dangerous because clearly it puts the systems through very sudden changes in direction, which are not helpful in terms of building long-term capacity. But it's also the case that probably you want neither of these approaches. What you need to do is find the balance between them. And I think clearly not enough governments in post-war history in Britain have been able to do that. And I think as a consequence, implementation has not been as successful in many instances as perhaps it should have been. It's an interesting question. I think it's, in some respects, the case that evaluation gets missed as a very important part of the policy process. Although I think it's also important to say that governments have begun to take evaluation more seriously. Investment in activities related to evaluation has increased to some extent, and that's been the case both from the previous Labour government up until 2010, and then after 2010, the Cameron government invested in this network of what are called What Works centres, which obviously focus on particular areas of public policy and social policy, but are designed to really bring together the best evidence in a particular area, in some cases commission new evidence and new evaluation, so as to generate the best synoptic understanding of the problems and the issues in a particular sphere of public policy. And I think when you combine that with departmental initiatives to improve evidence-led policymaking, that suggests that evaluation is in some respects being taken more seriously, at least in some parts of government. Having said that, there are clearly problems with evaluation, and I think one dimension that's often missed is the politics of the evaluation process. The reality is that evaluators do face a big challenge because they have to present results which sometimes appear to contradict the claims of politicians. I think there are other issues which are more prosaic in a sense about the time lag between evaluation being commissioned and when a minister is actually in office to use the evaluation evidence to change policies. It's clearly the case that in many longitudinal evaluations, the evaluation evidence tends to be generated well after the minister has ceased to be the minister in charge of that area of policy. So I think there are some inherent problems about how you design the evaluation process. But there are also developments. So I think the increasing use of policy experiments, the use of randomised controlled trials, some of the approaches that are being developed through behavioural economics and behavioural psychology are essentially providing policymakers with smarter and quicker ways of conducting evaluations. So I think the field is changing in ways that could also help to make evaluation a more important element within the implementation process, because I think there is a risk that evaluation can be missing from policy making too often. And obviously, as I said, governments are doing more to invest in it, but you can never do enough to emphasise the importance of taking evaluation seriously in policy making, and not just being led by the politics of a particular issue, but really trying to look hard at what the evidence tells you, and also trying to learn lessons about what works and avoiding very sudden knee-jerk changes in policy. In terms of how we make policy, I think probably the biggest development in the last 10 or 20 years has been around the increasing use of data and the way in which data gets incorporated into different aspects of the policy process. So I would say if you want to be an effective policymaker today, you need to be someone who's numerate as well as literate, and someone who's comfortable with the use of different kinds of data and can think about ways of using data to make policy better. That would be my sort of very broad conclusion about what you need to do well as an effective policymaker. I think in terms of what's changed and what you need to be aware of, I think in some respects policy making has become harder. I mean, policymakers, both ministerial policymakers and civil service policymakers, are under much greater scrutiny than was probably the case 20 or 30 years ago. And you're also dealing with a politics where, certainly in more controversial areas of policy, people can be very quick to cast blame. There's often a lot of blame shifting or transference of blame from one set of actors to another. So you need to be, I think, quite tough to be an effective policymaker, and you need to also be aware of the difficult political environment in which you're operating. I think often when we talk about the politics of policymaking, civil servants in particular can be somewhat uncomfortable with that notion, because the tradition in the British civil service has been one of neutrality, non-partisanship, and to some extent keeping a distance from politics. I mean, all of that is right, but I think there's also a small p politics to the policy-making process that you have to understand. Another aspect of that is about involving users in the policy process. I think 30 or 40 years ago, a lot of public policy was still made on the basis that it should be expert-led. I think one of the big developments in more recent times has been the understanding that you have to involve users much earlier, in fact very often right at the start of the policy making process, rather than bringing users in at the end as a kind of add-on. So I think having some familiarity and understanding of those issues is absolutely essential in understanding the politics of policy making and where policy making has gone over the last several decades.